The New Science of Guillaume Battista Vico. Principi di Scienza Nuova di Guillaume Battista Vico, di intorno alla comunatura della nazioni. Principles of New Science of Guillaume Battista Vico concerning the common nature of the nations. So read the title page of the third edition, which appeared in July 1744, 6 months after Vico's death. This is my copy of the New Science of Vico. New Grand Interpretations, Progress in History. Historicism, or Guillaume Battista Vico et Historismus. Few interpretations of history gave and have captivated the minds of the multitude to the extent that the theory of progress has. Its central message declared that the whole human race, through alternate periods of rest and unrest, of wealth and woe, goes on advancing, although at a slow pace, towards greater perfection. Past, present, and future were once more linked in a development with a common direction, this time not toward a spiritual goal, but toward human betterment in this world. And it was this hope which proved to be the powerful persuader. Actually, with the exception of the Marquis de Condorcet's sketch for a practical picture of the progress of the human mind, 1793 to 1794, no one work proclaimed and explained the concept of progress. Rather, progress was proposed, debated, and praised in many works, and belief in it became sustained less by an agreed-upon theory than by a broadly shared expectation. Of course, we see historicism in Hegel of the 19th century, although we first see it in Montaigne of the 17th century, and of course, here we see it in Vico of the 18th century. History as the emancipation of mankind. The progress view had a firm support in the conviction of many 18th century intellectuals that mankind had matured sufficiently to take its destiny into its own hands. God had created the universe, as they had believed, set the orderly system of causes in motion, and from then it moved in Newtonian orderliness by itself, with the world rationally ordered and beneficent in essence. Everything destructive in it was declared to be, quote, unnatural and remediable. Similarly, human beings were seen as basically good. That was not Sir Francis Bacon's view, nor was it what was his name? That was not the view of Thomas Hobbes, but it was the view of Rousseau. And so, similarly, human beings were seen as basically good and not as inherently sinful. In turn, however, human goodness was firmly anchored in human rationality. Both qualities were extant even in the distant past, when strong passions and instincts, together with the forces of the environment, had suppressed them temporarily. On that basis, some philosophers proceeded to demonstrate the story of human progress, that is, the gradual liberation of rationality from bondage throughout the centuries, and the civilizing of mankind resulting from it. The unity of mankind's destiny was no longer besouched by the common descent from Adam and Eve, as had formerly been thought, but by the presence of reason in its every member, and its development bore no longer the marks of divine providence, but those of the emancipation of rationality from error and superstition. The philosophers and philosophers had to reconcile the immense diversity of the world's peoples with their view of a uniform and unchanging human nature. In taking on that task, they relied on the new concept of culture, or civilization, which had eluded the 16th century legists and historians when they had confronted the diversity of peoples and customs in the age of exploration and scientific endeavor. The philosophers could draw on the insight proposed by the so-called Histoire raisonnée. Between 1660 and 1720, its representatives had stressed the idea that sets of customs needed to be studied and then compared with each other. When Francois de Fenelon had exhorted historians to study the change of customs in time, he fairly nearly had formulated the change Voltaire had taken up. In his essay on the manners, customs, and the spirit of nations, written in 1754, Voltaire formulated the cultural interpretation of history precisely and elegantly. After sympathetically treating the Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Islamic civilizations, he nevertheless held fast to a universal human progress, thereby affirming for him the obvious contemporary superiority of the West. These historians found the solution to the problem of the diversity of cultures in the concept of the uneven development of uniform human nature. Westerners differed from the Chinese, Africans, or Indians not intrinsically, but solely because of the greater progress of their rationality. The lag was caused by the irrational forces still gripping the other societies, above all by oppressive religions, laws, and customs. The same held true for the differences within Western societies, where rationality increased first in the minds of a few, with the masses lagging temporarily behind. And as we see this in Europe, and then, of course, goes on into the world of the Americas. And if, as Voltaire and some others maintained, the majority of people might never become fully rational in thought and behavior, those who were fully civilized could design good laws and offer good government for the masses. As a result, all people would partake in rationality's ultimate blessings, that of happiness. By necessity, the pride of the new historical order, with its progress and perfect future, was a lack of appreciation of the very diversity which originally had fascinated the philosophers. In his essay, Voltaire discussed the past views and habits of various peoples sympathetically, but still at a far distance from our present understanding of civilizations or cultures. And as you know, we find historicism first slowly creep up in the ideas of Montaigne and the essayist, and then we see it also in Vico, and then eventually in Hegel. When after the year 1770 the term civilization first appeared, it referred to a style of life with refined tastes and manners, presumably brought about by the increase of rationality. Our present contention that all civilizations or cultures constitute equally valid ways of life would have been scoffed at by Voltaire and other philosophers. True happiness could not come to people with uncivilized views and customs, but only to those with a rational mode of life. The assertion of progress also devalued the earlier stages of the Western world, which were at best periods of human childhood or infancy, at worst periods of folly and superstition. That very attitude showed up in the philosophers' lament about the Middle Ages. To them, these centuries, dominated by the Christian religion and also the Muslim faith, constitute a regrettable interruption of the liberation of reason, which the ancients had gotten underway. Of course, the kings without any authority, the nobles without any constraint, the peoples enslaved, the countryside covered with fortresses and ceaselessly ravaged, wars kindled between city and city, village and village, penetrating, so to speak, the whole mass of kingdoms, all commerce and all communications cut off, the towns inhabited by poor artisans enjoying no leisure. Only the leisure which some men still enjoy lost in the idleness of a nobility scattered here and there in their castles, who do nothing but engage in battles which are useless to the fatherland, the grossest ignorance extending over all the nations and all occupations. An unhappy picture, but one which was only too true of Europe for several centuries. And while Turgot and Montesquieu considered the medieval church's enhancement of learning at least one redeeming feature, most others condemned institutional religion as superstition, and considered medieval history excellent proof for Condorcet's judgment that history was, quote, man's confession of past superstitions and fanaticisms. Those more ardent about progress than the somewhat skeptical Voltaire were revolutionaries in historical interpretation. For centuries, the past as tradition had guided human actions in the present and human hopes for the future. But now, in a total reversal, the expectations for the future governed the life of the present and the evaluation of the past. Propellants and patterns of progress. As the philosophers saw it, progress fought against nearly impossible odds, although, throughout the centuries, the forces of darkness, error, and vice had held a tight grip upon humankind. Reason had managed to assert itself against such odds in the 18th century Enlightenment, as Turgot argued, because the blindly surging human passions led to superstitions and errors, and the unhappiness they produced in turn stimulated the progress of rationality. But now that reason had become strong, errors and superstitions were no longer needed as stimuli, and hence must be combated vigorously. Condorcet proclaimed his time to be the historic turning point precisely because the main weapon against error had been found. Quote, having long been engaged in pondering the means of improving man's fate, I have not been able to avoid the conclusion that there is actually only one such means, the speeding of the progress of enlightenment. The human mastery of the social realm would follow the already highly advanced mastery of nature, much as the advance of the moral social sciences followed that of the natural sciences. For Condorcet, the liberation of mankind from the tyrannies of nature and irrational social authority was, in fact, inevitable, because rationality, once set on its victorious course, asserted itself against all obstacles. When human beings had begun to order chaotic sensations into comprehensive thought, they had initiated the progress of the mind. This progress would culminate in the final 10th epoch, when the social art would triumph over everything standing in the way of social harmony. History, besides being the human confession of past errors, also spurred hope for such a future when it told of the ideal state of affairs to come. How welcome to the philosopher is this picture of the human race, freed from all its chains, released from the domination of chance and from that of the enemies of its progress, advancing with a firm and sure step in the path of truth, virtue, and happiness. How the spectacle consoles him for the errors, crimes, and injustices that still defile the earth, of which he is often the victim. It is in the contemplation of this picture that he finds the reward for his efforts on behalf of the progress of reason and the defense of liberty. In all of that, the philosophers ascribed an ambiguous role to the natural and social environment. On the one hand, reason had its own liberating dynamics, while on the other, environmental stimuli played a significant role in human progress. Thus, Condorcet and Turgot agreed that the improvement in the means of communication had helped the growth of knowledge by provoking more and more innovations. Condorcet even granted that in the late stages of progress, liberty, equality, secular and enlightened government, property, and peace were necessary for further progress, although quite clearly such a social environment presupposed rational people as its shapers. In general, however, the influence of the physical environment became weaker the stronger human rationality grew. That held true despite the age's fascination with the shaping force of climate. Montesquieu, indeed, had elaborated on the role of climate, and Turgot mused that large-scale climatic changes might have caused past changes in government. According to Condorcet, the march of history had slowed down at times, but could never aim anywhere else but forward. Those writing before him, however, had not been so sure. Turgot admitted temporary delays in human progress and gave it a spiral-like path toward the desired goal, not a linear one. Empires rise and fall. Laws and forms of government succeed one another. The arts and the sciences are in turn discovered and perfected, in turn retarded and accelerated in their progress, and they are passed on from country to country. Émile Deschamps envisioned steep rises alternating with plateaus, evoking the image of steps in a huge staircase. Others, of course, tempered their optimism more severely when they pointed out the unpredictability of life, where a single battle could truly change the course of historical events. Condillac and d'Alembert spoke of peaks of civilized existence alternating with plainly barbaric periods. Barbarism lasts for centuries and seems to be our natural condition, while reason and good taste are destined to pass away. Voltaire, whose own rationalism never persuaded him that all people would ever behave rationally, pointed to mankind's up and down development, the civilized ancient period, the barbaric Middle Ages, and then the recovery of civilization in the Renaissance, followed by a quick rebarbarization in the Reformation, and then another recovery in the French civilization of Louis XIV's period. Inevitable, however, progress was by no means an item of faith for every philosopher. History's role. While philosophers spoke of progress in terms of advances in human learning and morality, most of them were also convinced that any increase in rationality would be matched by a commensurate increase in happiness. In Condorcet's 10th epoch of history, the conditions for happiness, peace, justice, flourishing commerce, and equality between peoples and nations resulted from the triumph of reason as manifested in an ever-increasing knowledge, cooperative scholarship, and education. And what could history contribute to so favorable a development, besides being man's confession of its own errors? The philosophers did not study the past just in order to understand it on its own terms. They mustered little sympathy for the erudites, with their love for the patient exploration of past experience through documents and without didactic purpose. Montesquieu called them compilers who have little to say, and Voltaire told them that not everything happening was worth knowing. History must therefore teach the progressive enlightenment of mankind, and through it become one of the instruments of progress itself. In his Age of Louis XIV, Voltaire spoke of history's cleansing property, since the history of human stupidity could bring people to recognize and acknowledge past errors. Thus, in his own otherwise quite traditional history of Charles the 12th, life should teach kings how much a peaceful and happy rule is superior to so much glory. Even the story of the Middle Ages and the medieval past could teach readers when it shocked them with those errors and superstitions which Voltaire and others found so painful to report. But text with such lessons would only be useful if people would read them willingly, even eagerly, and so the philosophers such as Kant, etc., strove for eloquence and elegance in their writing. Voltaire succeeded better than others, and fame became his reward, although he rarely was an original as a thinker as other philosophers. Actually, an Englishman had best expressed the attitude of the philosophers toward history when he quoted Dionysius of Halicarnassus. History is philosophy teaching by examples. Again, that was an ancient writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, saying that history is philosophy teaching by examples. Descent from progress. When 18th century scholars rejected the orthodox Christian views on the course of history, they did not simply affirm random change. Their new order for the world acquired continuity through progress, but there were philosophers who rejected the optimistic view of development. Jean-Jacques Rousseau regretted the increase in rationality achieved in isolation from all other human faculties, particularly that of emotion. A long time ago, that he said, in the state of nature, reason, passion, and emotion were of a whole, and even the instinct of self-preservation strengthened natural cooperation and morality. Of course, he had a different view than that of Thomas Hobbes. Then, in a sort of fall of man, he said, things changed. Property, hierarchy, and self-love appeared, and worked to the detriment of concern for others. The human being acquired an external aspect, a false, deceptive, pretentious, and hence evil wish to impress others, and then this aspect was alienated from the internal aspect, the true self. Culture was the product and producer of that alienation, according to Rousseau, one ever more enhanced by the development of reason in isolation from other parts of the human psyche. With culture thus rooted in vice rather than in virtue, the story of humankind was the story of decadence. The materialists among the philosophers simply had no use for history without progress. Human beings were merely complex animals governed by the desire to gratify their needs in order to find happiness. At all times, human life was the same story of need and gratification, and attraction and repulsion. In such a mechanistic world, the advance of science, history included, was irrelevant to human happiness. And so many only knew a chain of causation, not of free will, providence, God, progress, or immortality. History could teach no useful lessons about such a world of nature to human beings found by nature's dictates. From an entirely different viewpoint, the Scot David Hume rejected all talk about a benevolent universe in progress. He insisted that all the order we observe around us, causality, for example, was really a habit of the human mind rather than an expression of an order inherent in phenomena. Hence, neither the presuppositions of science nor the metaphysics of reason can be accepted as reflecting actual reality in history. Historical viewpoints, the progress view included, were private matters. David Hume wanted historians to rely on a cautious empiricism without grand schemes, although he himself asserted the highly theoretical concept of an unchanging human nature. The doubters, however, and opponents of progress had their followers as well, but Condorcet's optimism lured the majority of people. The message of progress evoked enthusiasm and hope. Behind the ups and downs of empires, states, wars, and nations, there was the steady advance of the natural and moral sciences. These sciences, both natural and social, would defeat the twin evils of ignorance and the caprice of will. In Condorcet's 10th epoch, beginning in the late 1700s, public schools, social mathematics for calculating the consequences of actions, and the social art, or social science, would guarantee the infinite perfection of the human condition, with happiness as the automatic result. With Christian universal history in disarray, the West had acquired in the progress theory a new and viable synthesis of both past, present, and future. New grand interpretations, the cyclical pattern, by Gian Battista Vico, God and the Cultural Cycle. When in the early 18th century, Battista Vico formulated his grand cyclical version of history, he based it on his anti-Cartesian view of the human being as not purely rational and as a member of groups, not as isolated individuals. Since, as was already shown, Vico denied that the natural sciences could explain human phenomena, he set out to create a new science, which could shed light on the developments in collective life. It turned into an investigation of the whole human past in terms of the life cycles of nations. And again, if you just look in his book 4 of the course of nation, how the course of the nations run, we see he has in his different sections, of course 9, he has 3 kinds of natures, 3 kinds of customs, 3 kinds of natural law, 3 kinds of government, 3 kinds of languages, 3 kinds of characters, 3 kinds of jurisprudence, 3 kinds of authority, 3 kinds of reason. And of course, that's only in book 4. He has 5 books. In book 5, he talks about the recourse of human institutions which the nations take when they rise again. Of course, in book 3, he talks about the discovery of the true Homer. In book 2, he talks about poetic wisdom, and then in book 1, the establishment of principles. All of these cycles followed one unvarying pattern in Vico's story, the Storia Eterna, ideal, with 3 successive stages, the eras of gods, the era of heroes, and the era of men. Vico considered that a basic pattern to have been designed by what he called divine providence. Of course, Vico was a devout and traditional Christian. He preserved an essential part of the Christian historiography when he treated the Old Testament story until the end of the flood as an accurate narrative. But from the time of the descendants of the ancients in the biblical story on, a different human history began that no longer was identical with Jewish history. In fact, in the 200 years after the flood of the biblical passage, human beings lost the facility for human speech, lacked all social institutions, wandered around as horrible, stupid brutes, and gratified their drives without inhibitions and shame until events occurred which launched them into a civilized life. Vico's brutes did not suddenly conclude a social contract, as some contemporary natural law theoreticians supposed. If you think about the social contract of Rousseau, but created civilization gradually. As the earth dried up, excessive evaporation led to fierce thunderstorms, according to Vico. Their frightful thunderclaps brought to early people experiences of terror, fear, and particularly sexual shame, which prompted the brutes to reflect upon the world, and as they did, they began to tame their impulses. When they buried their dead, regulated sex, and introduced formal worship, they took the first steps toward providing for a time span longer than the immediate present, and created the basis for the 3 fundamental social institutions of burial, marriage, and religion. On these 3 pillars of ancient human society, we would say civilization was built. In the first stage of human civilization, the age of gods, the stern rules and rights were seen by people as directly ordained by the gods, a necessary conviction because divine authority alone could impose a new order of authority. In a decisive interpretation, Vico saw that the new order not only shaped the social institutions, but the total collective consciousness of humans, the natural social bonds, particularly the family, epic poetry, myths as explanations, and authority resting in the heads of families. Divinely sanctioned law, piety, and even a basic cruelty were no mere accidental collection of characteristics, but necessary expressions of the new order. And so it was with the stages and heroes and of men. Each of them had its own structure, its own collective consciousness, its own cultural climate, so to speak, which colored laws, politics, marriage, religion, poetry, in short, all human actions and institutions. Vico had discovered the concept of culture as a systematic whole. Of course, all of that did not suggest to Vico an autonomous human world with self-regulating mechanisms, but rather order and design due to what he called divine providence. In biblical times, the workings of that providence could be observed directly, but now that it worked more subtly by directed human feelings, passions, and reason, it needed to be studied indirectly through its manifestations. And so Vico talks about 3 stages of civilization. He speaks of the age of gods, the age of heroes, and the age of men. In the age of gods, the general character is prehistoric primitive culture, which is a period of infancy. The age of heroes has a general character of beginning of civil and political state, the period of youth, And then the age of men has a general character of society structured according to reason and with justice for all, a mature, rational stage. In the age of gods, the crucial social form is family and natural bonds. In the age of heroes, the crucial social form is the state or politics. And in the age of men, the crucial social form is the commonwealth, which is voluntary civic duty. In the age of gods, the explanation of change is actions of divine, supernatural, superstitious, all nature animated by spirits. The characteristic attitudes are in awe, reverence before the supreme powers or deities. In the age of heroes, the explanation of change is the actions of semi-divine heroes, the introduction of civilizing measures and lawgivers and founders of cities. In the age of men, however, the explanation of change is the actions of ordinary human beings who discover their powers. Doubt of previous myths and heroes, the past is then reinterpreted to be more palatable to logic and reason. In the age of gods, the language is poetic, metaphorical, and the poets shape the minds of peoples. In the age of heroes, the language is military speech or heroic blazonings. In the age of men, however, the language is logical, rational concepts. The age of prose, it is the philosophical, scientific character and the introduction of vernacular languages. In the age of gods, the records are the age of myth, oral narratives concerning the nature of the gods and their relations with men. In the age of heroes, we have the records of the age of bards. Poets relate deeds of heroes. And in the age of men, records tell people of the exploits of even ordinary people. The politics of the age of gods is theocratic, where a ruler is a voice of God, where aristocracies of fathers are included, as well as sovereign family kings. The politics of the age of heroes is heroic and aristocratic as well. Not most of those powerful, those that are the most powerful governed still by the divine right of kings. And then, of course, the age of men has a politics that is the people as a source of power. It is democratic government where equal rights reign. Nevertheless, there is monarchy still. In the age of gods, human nature is fierce and cruel. We think about that when we think about Thomas Hobbes. The age of heroes has a human nature that is militant. And in the age of men, the human nature is modest, benign, and reasonable according to the dictates of the Enlightenment. Of course, law in the age of the gods is divine in origin. The age of heroes, law is the law of force, but still controlled by religion. Only force keeps force within bounds. But in the age of men, law is human, dictated by reason, open process of lawmaking, and is no longer the aura of secrecy. Customs in the age of gods is religious and pious. Customs in the age of heroes is punctilious. And in the age of men, customs is dutiful, with a sense of civil duty. And that was Vico's 3 stages of civilization. Vico valued each of the 3 stages equally. Those enamored by progress would value the third, the humanistic stage, as the highest and assumed that it would last forever. But it was not so to Vico. As a flower begins its decay in the midst of its glorious bloom, so do human societies decline in the age of men. Decadence sets in when human rational powers are strongest. Justice reaches the highest, greatest number of people. Civic duty substitutes for mere obedience to law. Humans feel free and strong. Logic prevails in reasoning and prose and literature. Science explains nature, and equal rights sustain democracies. In a paradoxical way, according to Vico, human achievements defeat themselves. The age of men brings urbanization, and with it the disease of the cities, with its symptoms, including an excessive individualism which leads to the custom of each man thinking only of his own private interests, and in which people have reached the extreme of delicacy, or better, of pride, in which, like wild animals, they bristle and lash out at the slightest displeasure. A kind of thought is cultivated which erodes society's existing foundations, piety, acceptance of authority, and faith, without providing any new support for them, and it all leads to a lack of civic sense and eventually to civic and civil unrest. There then follows either a conquest by more cohesive people, or an absolute monarch, or a sinking deeper and deeper into a new barbarism. Of course, one only sees that Vico here sounds a lot like that of Varro and Polybius in the speaking of the fall of the Roman Empire. The fact that these people on the decline had once learned how to reflect makes the new barbarism only more vicious than the original one. The people will live like, quote, wild beasts in a deep solitude of spirit and will. Scarcely any two beings will be able to agree, since each follows his or her own pleasure or caprice, end quote. Could any society escape the cycle? According to Vico, well, only if it accepted a halt to its own development, as in the case of the American Indians with the coming of the white man, of the Carthaginians with their destruction by the Romans, and of a few other societies which were barred from development altogether by an unfavorable climate. Otherwise, the completion of the Corso was relentless, to be followed after a few hundred years by a new beginning, he calls the Ricorso. The cycle and the philosophes. The concept of a cultural cycle even occupied a modest niche in the edifice of the French Enlightenment. It was gleaned from ancient works and from organic life, and was never systematically elaborated in the manner of Vico henceforth. It also never matched the popularity of the progress interpretation of history by the Italian Vico, missing, as it did, the promise of permanent rationality and happiness. Turgot, for example, was not perturbed by the coming and going of empires, because, as he saw it, that fact did not impede the progress of knowledge and rationality. In comparison, the advocates of a cyclical theory sounded outright melancholy. For there is a cycle determined for all moral things, as for all natural phenomena, a cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death. So it is with the days from morning to evening, with the years in their solar revolution, with the life of man from cradle to grave, and with the course of states from their foundation to their demise. Progress was indeed a part of human life, but it was neither inevitable nor permanent. The fate which rules the world wills that everything should pass away. The happiest state of an individual or a nation has its limits. Everything carries within itself a hidden germ of destruction. Almost all the nations of the world travel this circle. They begin with being barbarians, and then they become conquerors and well-ordered nations. This order permits them to grow, and they become refined. But refinement enfeebles them, and then they return to barbarism. And as if the progress theoreticians had said enough about the time of prosperity, the 18th century proponents of the cyclical view talked less about the upward phase of the cycle, but more about its downswing. The fall of the Roman Empire, already a feature in some works since the Renaissance, came now to be the centerpiece of the cyclical theories in the 18th century Enlightenment. Writers like Montesquieu, who investigated the various influences that shaped a state, found the reasons for the decline of Rome in internal forces, the excessive luxury, and the failure to adjust the republican legal system to the needs of an empire. Of course, that's only echoed. That's echoed in Montesquieu, but he's simply just talking about what Polybius spoke about. The empirical Montesquieu shunned ideas of universal progress as unwarranted by historical evidence, and even connected the fate of learning with that of political power. They rose and fell together. Most other French proponents of the cyclical view also singled out luxury, with its corrosion of vigor and morals, as the culprit. A few philosophers blamed the foes of reason, the emotions, superstitions, and human passions, for the decline of societies. As with, think about David Hume, for example. In connection with the political fate of nations, Montesquieu observed, as with other philosophers, that however perfect a government may appear in theory, in practice and in the hands of men, it will always be subject to revolutions and vicissitudes. Finally, as long as it is men that govern men, even the best government will in fact destroy itself eventually. Little help could be gained from intensive studies of past cycles, since the observable external forces, the Abbé Dubos thought, were just the particular agents of a destruction that was predestined. Montesquieu, who had made an extensive analysis of the human past, had to admit, however, that the array of possible reasons for a civilization's decay and collapse was simply as wide as life itself. The basic forces will remain unknown, and so the French adherents of the cyclical view found history to resemble a kaleidoscope with ever new configurations of the same materials, or as one of them expressed it, "In the morning both man and plant appear, and in the evening they are no more. Everything disappears and is replaced, but nothing perishes."